Hi, it's Alexander Russo with The Grade. This is the Education Show, and I'm here today with the New York Times' Natasha Singer. Natasha, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Alex.
For people who might not know who you are, can you tell us?
Yes, I am a technology reporter at the New York Times, and I specifically cover tech in schools and how the tech industry is shaping classrooms. And I'm also the author of a forthcoming book in September called Coding Kids Big Tech's Battle to Remake Public Schools.
You have been covering technology in schools for a long time now, and I wanted to ask you right off the bat, what's your sense of myths and misconceptions that people have about technology in schools? What do they get wrong? What do we get wrong? What do I get wrong?
Well, you and I are the OGs on this, and we have been seeing for years a pattern of the tech industry coming up with a new product and then telling schools that it's absolutely urgent to train kids to use it and that this tool will transform education. And also, there's a FOMO, like if you don't teach students how to use this, they won't be able to get jobs.
Right.
And you can trace this back if you want to Tom Edison in the early 1900s, who was like, we must get motion pictures in schools because it's going to transform education. Or you can trace it to the 1980s when tech companies were trying to get their desktop computers into schools, and we got computer labs through Chromebooks. Chromebooks were going to be transformational and give everybody democratic access to information. Through every classroom needs high-speed Wi-Fi. Through and there was a point where international groups like the World Economic Forum and UNICEF and others were saying, we got to get social media into schools and smartphones because it will democratize access to education and will transform learning. And it'll give kids access to all this information and connectivity around the world that will, open up worlds for them. And
Right.
so I think for me, I guess it's not a misconception, but I think the context is really important, that we now have this huge tech industry crusade to get AI chatbots in schools and to get teachers to use them to teach and students to use them to learn. And there was a huge promotion already about there will be automated teaching bots that will customize learning to each child in the moment. And I think it's just really important to put this latest push for AI in the historical context, because one of the things that's interesting, and again, we're the OGs, I wonder how you think about this, but it feels like collective amnesia to me, that each time there's a new big tech hype cycle in school that we have to get the latest tool into the classroom, we forgot that there's not a lot of evidence for the last 6 to 12
Right.
pushes for tech in schools. There's not a lot of
Right.
evidence that these things improved educational outcomes for students or actually democratized access to anything. And
Right.
so I'm interested in what you think. Why do you think we have collective amnesia? I think journalists also have collective amnesia sometimes.
I have long felt that journalists often fell into the edtech hype cycle, the hand waving and the speculation about the Star Trek future that lay ahead of us, and haven't been as skeptical as they could have been along the way. And I'm hoping that that's not the case this time around. I keep asking edtech folks who tell me, "Oh, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater." That's the current spiel I hear all the time. I keep saying, "Okay, well, show me the baby. What's the baby that the edtech AI in schools baby that we should be so careful about?" I want to ask you though, whether now in 2026, given that context, so helpful, so important, do people understand or misunderstand the amount and type and effectiveness of technology in schools? If I just read headlines, which is sometimes really all I have the energy to do, I would think that every school was awash in tech and that kids were staring at screens all day and that it was really sort of dystopian. What's the reality in terms of tech in schools, whether you're for it or not?
Well, I think the big question that parents are asking right now, I mean, I think there's a whole concern about screen time. And I think that that's connected to cell phones and social media. But I also think parents have specific concerns and questions about ed tech. And what they're saying is, my kid is using this math app and this reading app, and this PowerPoint app and this image generating app. And how much is our district spending on these? And what evidence is there that these things benefit my child? And why is my kid having to use this math app that's all cartoony and gamified and awards points, and that maybe is not really teaching them math? And so I think that there are reasonable concerns in terms of how much time are students spending on, you know, laptops, Chromebooks, iPads every day. I don't think we know. I think
Okay.
that most school districts don't measure it. And there have been some recent groups saying, oh, we've measured it. It's not as bad as you think. It's only 20 minutes a day or 50 minutes a day. But like, then I get parents emailing me saying, well, did they actually use the Google tools and track what time did the kid open their Chromebook and log into the internet? And how many
Right.
hours have they been on that Chromebook today? So I think one of the things we're going to see is a push for more accurate measurement. But I also think that, it's not about time. It's about, is this tool actually benefiting the student? And some
Right.
tools are amazing. And I understand the argument of let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but show us that the baby actually had some benefit, right?
Right.
Like, I think there was a wave of wanting to get as much tech as possible in schools so that we could get students to be able to have a facility with them so that they went off to college and career. They would know how to use all these things. I mean, if you think of the parent generation that didn't know how to use email, right?
Right.
That was really hard. Of course, we want students to use these tools. The question is whether specific tools actually benefit education outcomes or whether, in fact, it's just they're on these gamified things that are really engaging like social media, but don't have outcomes. And then, as you know, we have 13,500 school districts in the United States. Each one does something different. And
Hmm.
so I go into schools where kids have opened their Chromebook at 8 in the morning and they're on them till 3 p.m. And I've been into other schools where, there's more specific use of laptops and apps. And it depends on the district. And it also depends who the superintendent is that year. Because I've been to districts where the superintendent came in and said, like Baltimore County Public Schools, we need to have a high grade laptop for every kid. We're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on this. And then
Right.
you bought these expensive laptops and you want to soup them up with all the software and you want kids to be on them all the time. And all the kids have headphones and they're listening separately and do them. And then the next superintendent comes in and says, actually, we have to go back to basics and concentrate on reading, writing, adding, multiplying, long division. And so it also goes in waves even within a school district.
You've written a bunch about edtech, and I and many others have really enjoyed the coverage. I wanted to ask you which was the most important or satisfying story you've written recently, let's say in the last 6 months. Is there one that stands out for you?
Well, there's two things that stand out for me. But, again, I should give the context that I'm not an education reporter, technically. I'm in the New York Times business section. I'm a technology reporter, and my job is to look at how tech companies impact schools and how tech impacts schools. And so these are stories about power. It's about how does Silicon Valley power enact itself in education ecosystems. And so that doesn't mean it's not about education. Of course, it's about education. It's about our kids learning from this and what are they learning and how are tech companies shaping how and what students learn. But it's
Right.
different from an education reporter who's also covering math, learning loss, and teacher contracts and other things. Like I'm not covering book bans. This is my full-time job is tech in schools. So, I did a piece this year on what we called Chromebook remorse. And you read it. It was about a school in McPherson, Kansas, which is about an hour north of Wichita. And they had decided, they had given kids Chromebooks starting in 2016. And they decided that they were going to take those back because you interviewed the principal, Inga Esping, and she discovered, they'd given the kids the Chromebooks to take home. And then they did an analysis and parents were complaining, why is my kid on their Chromebook all night and not doing their chores and not reading and not watching TV with a family? And she discovered that the vast majority of the time, the kids were using their Chromebooks at home to play games,
Yeah.
and to go on YouTube, but also to bully each other, right? They were setting up sessions on Zoom, but also they were using Google Docs to share things to hundreds of kids and write mean things about each other. And so she's like, well, most of the kids are not actually using their Chromebooks most of the time for homework. And
Right.
also the school had been really careful to not give a lot of homework. And so, last December, she said to families, you're going to have to turn in your Chromebooks. And they bought these carts. And so now the Chromebooks live in carts in classrooms. And they are used for specific purposes when the teacher says, here, we're going to do this exercise. And in some classes I sat in and the teacher was like, in English, ELA, in English class, you can use your Chromebooks to write this, or you can use, I printed out the paper. You can fill out, it was about a character analysis of a book. You can do it on paper. Most kids in the class I was in chose the paper. They're reading books, physical books, paperback books. They're reading comic books, like animated novels and things. And what was amazing about this is, right, it wasn't, we don't want any tech. It was, we want tech to be used for students' good for specific purposes. And then when they don't need it, we want them to be kids. We want them to run around recess without laptops. We want them to sit at lunch and talk to each other without cell phones. And I got there at like 7:30 in the morning before school started, and I heard the Pledge of Allegiance, and then the announcer made some really bad dad jokes, and boys, there'll be a tennis club meeting in the auditorium, right? And then Inga, the principal, took me to different classes. Though we spent the whole day there, I sat with sixth grade girls at lunch and asked them how they felt about having less tech. And, I sat with a whole bunch of different kids, so it wasn't like they were trained to say this, but most of the kids were like, oh, I'm talking to my friends more. I'm playing with my friends more. And some students were like, actually, it's annoying because I like to do my homework on a Chromebook and I have to go to the library to borrow one. So there were a few kids who found it more cumbersome. But, then I went to computer science class and everybody had a Chromebook. But the teacher was like, okay, we have a Chromebook. We could learn to program online and make virtual avatars move around. But instead, they were programming physical objects like sensors and lights, to show that you could use something in the online world to make something in the offline world work. And so, I think that the idea is that kids do not have to all be mini tech mogul entrepreneurs in the making. Some kids just want to be kids, and we should allow them to do that. And if using tech more intentionally helps that, then Inga, the principal, and the superintendent, and others and parents felt like that's a good thing for our kids who are under the age of 14. So I thought it was really, really interesting, but it's also really interesting for me personally because I had done a really big story about 10 years ago called How Google Captured the Classroom. And I spent months and months looking at this. And it was about all the techniques Google used to get its Chromebooks, which were new then, into classrooms, but also its software platform, its apps like Gmail, and Google Docs for school. And then they created an app called Google Classroom to help teachers organize teaching. And so at the time, the phrase we used to describe what was happening in schools was the Googleification of the classroom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Google was just becoming the biggest tech brand in schools. And in a sense, they were becoming the technical infrastructure on which education ran. And so now fast forward to here we are in McPherson, and they bought into that, right? I found the documents from the school board talking in 2016 about how amazing it was and the Chromebooks were going to be transformational, right? It was the same language the tech industry used that McPherson School Board was using to say, we're going to have these Chromebooks. And now they're like, maybe we went overboard. Maybe we can pull back to the middle somewhere and figure out where the middle is and have what they're calling intentional tech use. And so the word that came to mind to me was remorse, Chromebook remorse. It seemed to capture the feeling of a district that had bought into the tech industry marketing with good intentions and realized that actually schools were best placed to decide how technology is deployed and what is to the best interest of students. So it was a really interesting bookend to, more than a decade of tracking this.
I remember that initial story. Looking to the summer into the fall, what would you want parents, educators, and education journalists to be doing or thinking about? What types of questions or what types of coverage do you think would be most useful for folks who are trying to cover this in between covering book bans and other things?
That's a really good question. I'm thinking, I normally don't give advice, right? I'm a scribe. I ask other people and I write things down. So it's sort of hard to think about what I would tell other people. I think in general, my background is I used to cover the pharmaceutical industry. And there are natural questions that you ask if you're covering Big Pharma, and also that doctors ask. In medical school, medical students learn about medical ethics, and the ethic is first do no harm, but they also learn about conflict of interest. And we've seen in medicine how there have been lots of studies about how pharmaceutical companies try to skew medicine in their favor. They run courses for doctors, both medical students, and then there's continuing medical education. And you see that a medical device company that gives students free cadavers to operate on and put in artificial hips, right? those medical students are going to implant that artificial hip for life because that's what they've been trained on. And so in medicine and in covering pharma, we know that companies have influence, and we naturally ask, what is this influence? We also know that it's really important for pharmaceutical companies and device companies to have interactions with doctors because they do need to be trained on the latest thing. You don't want your doctor using some, medicine that's 30 years old if there's something better. But if there's something like aspirin where there isn't, right? It's something that's decade old that works. You do want them using it, and you want doctors to have the independence to make that decision and not be steered by the pharmaceutical industry. And so that's just my MO in tech, right? I'm asking the same questions. How is the tech industry shaping schools? What kind of rhetoric is being used to make schools rush to adopt AI? And, I was on a panel at the Education Writers Association, which you were at in Baltimore a few weeks ago, and I showed some images of the language that the tech industry is using. And it says, you're looking at Microsoft or Google, and it's like, teachers will help you prepare your students for an AI-driven future, right? Or the AI-driven future. Or
Yes.
like, our AI is the best study buddy and thinking partner for your students. And so again, as somebody who used to cover the pharmaceutical industry, we would just ask, like, what are they saying and what is it based on? So prepare your students for the AI-driven future. One of the problems with that, it just skips over the present. Do we want an AI-driven future? It prevents us from asking that question. I'm not saying that I don't think AI is going to be really important and cause infrastructural change worldwide in the United States and in schools, but I'm saying it skips over asking students and teachers what they want. And the same thing with RAI is your study buddy. RAI is your thinking partner. Well, it's an inanimate object. It is a product. It is not a buddy. It does not think. And what messages are we sending students if we just repeat industry rhetoric? And so, I'm getting calls from parents now and emails from parents because we're in this wave of parents pushing back against school tech and asking a lot of questions about school tech. And they're asking these questions, which I find amazing because I've always had emails and calls from parents concerned about school tech. It's led to some of my best stories over the years. But the scale at which parents are now voicing their concerns and reaching out to their school boards and their principals and their legislators and to journalists like me and many others, I've never seen this response on this kind of scale before. And they are asking, why are we sending out press releases that sound like a big tech company wrote it in our schools? And so I cannot tell folks what to do, but I guess I think the more people who are asking questions, the better, because we ask these questions in medicine and we don't perceive these questions in medicine as anti-medicine or anti-health. We just think like, yeah, we want to make sure medicine works. Let's ask the question. And so I just think these are reasonable questions to ask in schools, and you don't have to be afraid of tech or anti-tech or a Luddite or a skeptic to ask them. They are normal questions.
It's great to hear your thoughts on this. The comparison to Big Pharma is a fascinating one. I'm going to be thinking about that for days, I'm sure. You are everywhere right now, whether you want to be or not. You were on The Daily last week. You're here. You're going to be on a lot of shows much bigger than this. And obviously, then your book comes out. I really appreciate you coming on the Education Show and talking about your coverage and your thoughts. Thanks so much, Natasha.
Thank you.